Hey everyone, Brandon here from TruckSafe. Today we're diving into an issue that confuses a lot of carriers and drivers, the overlap between federal and state motor carrier safety regulations. When do the federal motor carrier safety regulations apply? When do state rules kick in? And what happens when they conflict? That's what we're tackling in this video, so stay tuned and do us a favor by clicking those like and subscribe buttons below. Alright, first let's talk about the basics. As we've addressed in other videos, the federal safety regulations, promulgated and enforced by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, or FMCSA, generally apply to commercial motor vehicles engaged in interstate commerce. That means any truck or bus that crosses state lines or is part of a trip that involves interstate commerce. On the other hand, if your operations are exclusively intrastate in nature, you're typically subject to a particular state's motor carrier regulations. Now, we've broken down how the FMCSA and its state partners distinguish interstate from intrastate commerce in a prior video. Check that one out if you missed it. But here's the catch. Most states in the United States adopt at least some portion of the federal safety regulations, even for exclusively intrastate operations within their borders, though there can be some deviation in those instances. One major factor influencing state motor carrier safety regulations is the Motor Carrier Safety Assistance Program, or MCSAP for short. States that participate in MCSAP, most of which do, receive federal funding from FMCSA for safety enforcement, but they have to agree to adopt motor carrier safety regulations that are at least as stringent as the federal safety regulations for intrastate carriers. That said, states still retain some flexibility to modify certain rules, and that's where things start to diverge. Even though MCSAP pushes for uniformity throughout the country, states have adopted different rules in key areas. Hours of service rules are a prime example. While carriers and drivers operating in interstate commerce must follow FMCSA's hours of service limits, some states impose different limits for drivers engaged only in intrastate commerce. Texas, for example, has a 12-hour daily driving limit for intrastate drivers instead of FMCSA's 11-hour limit. Additionally, definitions of what qualifies as a commercial motor vehicle can also differ between federal and state rules. In California, for example, certain state motor carrier safety regulations apply to for-hire intrastate operations regardless of the weight of the CMV, as opposed to the federal 10,001-pound threshold for property carriers. And looking at Texas again, it has raised the weight threshold for CMVs operated in intrastate commerce up to 26,001 pounds, meaning that its intrastate carrier safety regulations apply to a smaller subset of commercial vehicles than the federal rules. So what happens when a state's rules conflict with the federal rules? That's where federal preemption under a federal statute, 49 U.S.C. 31141, comes into play. FMCSA has the authority to invalidate state regulations if they create an unreasonable burden on interstate commerce or aren't in line with federal safety objectives. Over the years, FMCSA has struck down certain state rules for this reason. Meal and rest break laws in California and Washington, for example, were deemed preempted by FMCSA, at least for interstate regulated drivers, because they, according to the agency, interfered with federal hours of service regulations for those drivers. Similarly, some state-specific vehicle marking requirements have been challenged for being inconsistent with the federal rules governing that same topic. When FMCSA determines that a state's rule is preempted, it means interstate carriers operating in that state don't have to follow it. However, intrastate carriers and drivers may still be required to comply if the rule remains in effect at the state level. What about carriers that have mixed operations, some interstate and some intrastate? For those carriers, navigating these different rule sets can be a challenge. One strategy many employ to try and simplify the compliance is to follow the federal rules across the board, even for intrastate operations that may be subject to a more lenient state rule set. As a general proposition, the federal rules are typically more stringent than related state rules, so adopting them across the board helps to minimize compliance risk. That said, a few states in the country, looking at you, California, have some rules that are slightly more stringent than federal rules. For example, California imposes a 90-day vehicle inspection requirement for commercial vehicles operating in intrastate commerce in the state, as opposed to the annual inspection requirement for interstate vehicles under the federal rules. So understanding these state nuances and staying up to date on state-specific rules is critical for fleets that operate in multiple jurisdictions. In short, understanding the overlap between federal and state motor carrier safety regulations is key to staying compliant and keeping your operation running smoothly. If you want a deeper dive, check out our full article on this topic over at trucksafe.com. We'll drop the link in the description below. For even more in-depth information about these types of regulatory topics, be sure to check out our innovative online compliance courses for safety managers and for drivers over at trucksafeacademy.com. Also, if you're looking for an easier way to access and understand the federal motor carrier safety regulations, check out eRegs, the first app-based digital version of the regulations over at eregs.app. Lastly, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at trucksafe.com/subscribe and follow us on our various social media pages for the latest highway transportation news and analysis. Thanks for watching.